Hello and welcome to Digging for Britain, the programme which brings you this year's most exciting new archaeology. In this show, we'll be looking at highlights from all the digs, we'll get some in-depth analysis, and we'll be looking at treasures from the past. Hey! Once again, over the last year, archaeologists have been unearthing our history in hundreds of digs across Britain.
Go on! Fantastic. It's a two.
They've gone to extraordinary lengths to uncover secrets from the past, retelling our story in a way that only archaeology can.
It's in perfect mint condition.
Amazing.
Well done.
I was right.
And our archaeologists have been out filming themselves, so we have been there for every single moment of discovery. And then we're coming back here to Norwich Museum and seeing if we can really make sense of the new discoveries.
In this series, we'll be touring the country, and tonight we're in the southeast. First, we hear about incredible finds at a Bronze Age Pompeii in the Fens. We unearth an amazing hoard hidden in desperation as Queen Boudicca's tribe hunted down the Romans. And we discover weird burial rituals, revealing the secrets of Anglo-Saxon motherhood and childbirth. Norwich Castle Museum, originally a Norman fortress, is now home to the archaeological riches of the southeast. Norfolk is the treasure capital of England, and each year 20,000 finds are reported to the museum, more than in any other county. Finds like the Haysborough axe. Dating to 500,000 years ago, it comes from what's become one of the most important prehistoric sites in Britain. And the Snettisham hoard, the richest Iron Age treasure ever found in this country. Our first story takes us 70 miles away from Norwich, right into the heart of the Fenlands. Must Farm in Cambridgeshire is being called the Pompeii of the Bronze Age. Preserved in the wetlands of the Fens, this site is giving us an unparalleled glimpse of prehistoric life, going back over 3,000 years. In the past, archaeologists have uncovered ancient causeways running through the Fenland Basin, making them think that Bronze Age people saw this watery landscape as a sacred place, only visiting it on special occasions. But now, on the edge of a quarry, they're finding evidence of industrialised fishing, opening up a whole new perception of life in the Fens. It's something never seen before, and more importantly, they believe it could stretch for miles. This is archaeology on a massive scale. Mark Knight from the Cambridge Archaeological Unit has been analysing some of the most recent finds from a lost side channel of the River Nene.
Often we dig sites of the sort of Bronze Age in this region and we find one vertebra and we say that that's evidence for fish in the diet, or we say that maybe it's a chance find. But we're just finding lots and lots of fish, and we're finding things like pike and perch and carp and smelt. And then when we went to excavate the channel properly, we then found about 20 really beautifully preserved sort of sock-shaped baskets that are definitely fish traps. But alongside those, we're finding these sort of chevron-shaped wattle fences, forming these weirs across the length of the channel, regularly spaced along the entire area of the channel that we excavated. And there's a real sense here of an industry, perhaps, rather than maybe something sort of ad hoc and stuff. And remember, we've dug 300 metres, and we're looking at a channel that we can trace for at least 10 kilometres. If it's typical, then, you know, we're talking about hundreds of weirs and thousands of fish traps being set within its course.
Mark, what an extraordinary site. I mean, the preservation there is beautiful.
It's stunning, yes. It's one of those sites where you don't have to do a lot of sort of describing to visitors and things. They can see for themselves just what's there.
And it seems that fishing was going on an almost industrial scale then.
It's a surprise, I suppose, because we don't normally find fish bones in the faunal assemblages, so there we are finding weirs and traps everywhere.
So we know where these people were working. There must have been tens, hundreds of people possibly working in this industry. So where did they all live?
It's a really good question, and it's my opinion that basically they're living in the fens, they're living on the peat, they're living on the rivers, and we've got good evidence of that, and the sense that it corresponds to a phase within the dryland sites where there is no settlement. So it's as if they're colonising the wet, basically, and the traps and the weirs are part of that new landscape.
I think we've got some more from this incredible site. As the team continued their excavations in the side channel of the Nene, they started to find metalwork.
So we dig 300 metres of channel and we come up with a whole host of swords, spears and metal objects.
Finds like these are rare, but some have been found on other Bronze Age sites, leading to theories that they were ritual offerings for watery deities. But Mark believes the weapons recovered at Must Farm had a more practical use.
The sheer quantity of swords and spears and the sort of sense that this is a landscape that appears to be sort of newly colonised, we're starting to think that maybe the metalwork being found in the wet places was actually an indication of just the scale of occupation of the wet spaces themselves. So they were living on the rivers or they were living on the marshlands themselves.
Some of these swords also have nicks on the sides of the blades, signs of violence.
Swords like this were used to sort of slash things, and the idea was that if you were hitting someone, you'd get sort of marks on here, but if you were defending, then you'd get marks down here. And we've found swords with those consistent signatures of conflict, I suppose, of them being used in anger rather than just being sort of symbolic objects. You arrived being prepared to protect yourself at the very least, or maybe even upset people that were already in that landscape.
So Mark, you think these really were weapons, they're not just symbols?
I just find it impossible to think that all those swords and all those spears were just purely there for show, basically.
So it seems like quite an idyllic environment, but perhaps not as idyllic as all that.
Yeah, I suppose like any landscape that we occupy as human beings, there is this sort of, I don't know, tendency to sort of want to hang on to what you've got, basically. And you get a real sense within Fenland that there is a territory, the idea that this is our place.
So do you think this really was Bronze Age prime real estate then?
I get the feeling that basically this is the place to be, and essentially that the sort of switch has come from Stonehenge over to the main rivers of eastern England.
Right, we've got some more from your amazing site. The River Nene is an extensive wetland which was first created 4,000 years ago when sea levels rose. But the people of Bronze Age Britain took this climate change in their stride. In fact, they flourished here. Evidence of this resourcefulness is backed up by a significant discovery. Not one, not two, but 8 log boats. And unusually, virtually intact. The boats have been moved to Flag Fen and are now being conserved using the same methods that helped save the Mary Rose.
There's a real sense here that we're seeing the vessels of transport, of movement, maybe of fishing, but also of about the actual occupation and the settlement of Deep Fen. The first time we actually step off dry land and get into the deep sediment, we find 8 logboats in 300 metres of channel. So either, we found the one spot in the whole of Fenland, or this is representative of the rest of that landscape. And if it is representative of the rest of the landscape, then the scale was astonishing. And the sense that There are thousands of these boats up and down those channels and river courses, and they represent that sense of mass settlement of that wetland.
We often think that climate change always has a negative impact and that the wetlands would have been an inhospitable environment for humans, but Mark has other ideas.
What we're suggesting from our evidence is it was the opposite of that. It was no longer an impediment to settlement, and nor was it something that sort of made you retreat. It was actually a landscape that you were quite keen to inhabit. And the people had the imagination to find ways of getting into that space. And they maintained that link to the channel as well, as in the English Channel and the continent. And I think that's really important.
It's just extraordinary. I mean, those are quite big boats that you're finding there.
Yeah, one's 9 metres in length, so.
And why do you think they're at the bottom of the river? Is it anything to do with the swords and the other depositions?
You've got to remember there's 1,500 years of history in that channel, so, and there are boats throughout the sediment. So it's not necessarily the same story for each of the boats, but some of the boats are pristine, and they seem to have a connection with the weaponry. And it's quite often in the fens that you find boats close to swords or spears. So there seems to be a connection there. And at the same time, there are fragments of human skeletons within the channel as well. So if we wanted, we could form a sort of triangle here of swords, boats and bodies, and we can start maybe thinking about an association with maybe burial or something like that.
This is fascinating because when I think about Bronze Age burials, I think about kist burials, stone-lined, crouch burials.
Yeah,
I don't think of people having burials in water in their
but
boats.
I think, remember, this is the later Bronze Age, and if we try and find the burial record for that period, we can't. It's conspicuous by its absence, and I like that idea that we're not the first people to suggest that people were being buried in rivers. It's been, the Thames is famous for its Bronze Age skulls and things like that, and the association with swords and things. Maybe some of those boats, their pristineness is the fact that they had a body attached to a sword in its scabbard and things, and it was, you know, sunk in that river and things. So these are the possibilities that we're coming across.
So you're pushing archaeological boundaries as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think you feel like we're on a slope to the bottom of the North Sea, and on the way down there we're going to explore the whole of the British prehistory, and I think that's the excitement about it.
Must Farm, with its amazing wealth of finds, is the perfect example of how new archaeological discoveries can completely change our ideas about the past. And while Bronze Age people rose to the challenge of the fenlands, creating a highly productive fishing industry, it seems that they were also respecting the watery landscape with ritual offerings of swords to the gods. Like this stunning Bronze Age dirk or long dagger back here in the museum.
So Tim, what have you brought in for us today?
What I really wanted to show you is something that the museum has just acquired and is an absolute star object for showing you something like ritual from the Middle Bronze Age.
Incredible, it's huge. And that's the blade along there, is it, that edge?
It is, it's the blade edge, but one that's never been sharpened. So it's deliberately made, but not with the intention of ever using as a weapon. And the same goes for the hilt here. It's never actually been hafted on.
Why is it so large?
Well, it is because it's purely for ceremony. We don't quite understand why, but it's one of only 6 in Europe. There are 2 from England, 2 from France, and 2 from Holland that are now known. Something that suggests there's a North Sea trade link, perhaps.
So it's real proof that in the Bronze Age there really was a proper organised trade network across Europe.
Absolutely. But the interesting thing about this is, in being the second from England, both of them are from Norfolk.
I mean, it looks like a very sturdy object. How come it's been bent?
Well, we often find with Bronze Age weapons that they seem to be bent or deliberately destroyed before they're placed in the ground, and that seems to be part of the ritual killing of the object itself. So again, it's putting it out of commission, and again, it's part of, presumably, the ritual involved in why you have them in the first place.
And just 50 miles from our museum, Colchester was once the beating heart of Roman Britain, until an uprising led by a British warrior queen. In various eras, Boudica has been described by historians as a bloodthirsty savage, a freedom fighter, and even a feminist icon. But it's archaeology that's revealed the harsh realities of the Boudican revolt. In AD 61, Colchester was the first town to feel the full wrath of the Queen and her Iceni tribe. Archaeologists digging behind a Fenwick store in the town centre are unearthing a story of one Roman woman whose house was burned down in the fighting.
It's quite amazing when you stand in the excavation and you could almost feel you're standing in the burnt out remains of her house, because the floors are all scorched red and black and the walls are all reddened, big lumps of clay block wall lying on the floors.
The team are trying to trace the last moments of this house and its owner. Back at the Colchester Archaeological Trust, Project Officer Adam Whiteman's taken up the trail.
This is the remains of charred foodstuffs. We found 1 or 2 wooden planks, which either come from some shelves or a table, and spread over the top of those were foodstuffs that have been preserved as they've been carbonised. Here we have, these are burnt figs. You can see all the little seeds in those. These are burnt dates. And this selection here has been hand-picked out of this soil sample. And these are a selection of peas and small wheat grains and possibly some various other sorts of legumes.
Were these blackened foodstuffs the interrupted last meal prepared by the lady of the house?
Very touching to see it lying there, scattered, blackened on the floor.
And just outside the incinerated home, what appears to be evidence of a violent death.
These were discovered actually on the edge of a Roman street. These 2 bones appear to exhibit injuries. This mandible here is missing a slice of bone there. And this tibia is also missing a piece there. The cuts appear to be quite clean, look like they've been done by a sharp blow. They're sort of more comparable to a butchery mark on an animal bone rather than the mark of a shovel or a spade from the clearance of the building. So chances are these bones actually tell us even more of a gruesome tale than just having been spread on the side of the road.
Behind all this violence was Boudica. Originally, she was an ally of the Roman invaders, but they annexed her lands, flogged her, and raped her daughters. In 61 AD, a revolt swept across the east. The Romans who weren't murdered fled for their lives. The team believes that this house was right in the path of the rebels and that the woman who lived here hid something before she left.
What we found in this excavation was an extraordinary discovery of this desperation act. This well-off lady had taken all her precious jewellery and buried it in this tiny little hole, just big enough for her to stuff it all in and cover it, in the hope, I suppose, that she was going to be able to go back and recover it after the big emergency was over. But of course that never happened.
Carefully unpicked in the lab, the jewellery, now known as the Fenwick hoard, had lain hidden from the Iceni, and for almost 2,000 years after that. Earrings, armlets, chains, and rings. One woman's treasures. A poignant memento. But history suggests a grim fate for the owner of this hoard.
Dio Cassius is the one that tells us what happened in Colchester to the women. The noblest, for which we can read the richest, and that would be this lady surely, were rounded up and taken to sacred groves, groves which were dedicated to the British goddess of victory. and there they were horribly sacrificed.
They hung up naked the noblest and most distinguished women, and then cut off their breasts and sewed them to their mouths, in order to make the victims appear to be eating them. Afterwards, they impaled the women on sharp skewers run lengthwise through the entire body. Tim, that sounds horrendous, but this could just be Roman propaganda. But the archaeology is telling us something unequivocal, that there was a revolt here.
The archaeology is certainly telling us that there's a destruction layer that occurred at exactly the time that it's documented that the revolt took place. And so it's not unreasonable to assume that that destruction layer is associated with the documented historical revolt. That's right.
Why have you brought these particular artefacts?
This is exactly the reason. If we look at these, they're two very interesting artefacts, one of which is from the Castle Museum, and it's a fragment of a horse statue. And the head here is on loan to us from Colchester and Ipswich museums. And it's actually a copy of a head that's the original of which is now in the British Museum. And it's the head of Claudius, the emperor who undertook the invasion of Britain. And they seem to be from the same statue of the Emperor Claudius, an equestrian statue.
Were they found in the same place?
They weren't. The head was found in the River Ald at Rendham in Suffolk in 1907 by a boy splashing around in the river.
Right.
And the part of the horse was found by a metal detectorist in Norfolk in 1979. So 37 miles apart.
So how can you tell they're from the same statue then?
Well, that's a good question. We can't be absolutely sure, but metal analysis shows that there's a very low lead content in both of the bronzes, and it suggests that they are one and the same. It should also be added that there are no other fragments of statue like this in East Anglia, so they're a rare bird to start with.
So do you think the statue had been deliberately destroyed then and smashed up after the Boudiccan revolt?
Almost certainly. The head has been wrenched off, and the leg also seems to have been torn up. And I think it's interesting that they haven't been melted down and reused. They've actually been deposited. And with the head in the river, it could easily be something like a sacrificial offering to a river.
What happened after the revolt?
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't have a very happy ending for the Icenian people, because after burning Colchester, going on to London and Verulamium, they're defeated in the West Midlands and Roman rule is imposed. And in particular, it's probably imposed very severely in East Anglia, which were considered very dangerous and rebellious areas.
From the story of treasure hidden by one desperate woman swept up in a bloody revolt, we move to a dig in Oakington that gives us amazing insight into the place of women in Anglo-Saxon society. Even today, childbirth can be a risky and worrying time, but it was far riskier for our ancestors. A team from the University of Central Lancashire has spent the last 5 years investigating life and death in an Anglo-Saxon community. They returned this year and made some truly remarkable discoveries. Here's their dig diary.
So we are in Oakington, and this is the 2014 excavation. This is our main trench. We have a significant early Anglo-Saxon cemetery, which includes 124 graves. They date pretty much to the 6th century AD.
But what's unusual about this cemetery is the number of infant burials.
We appear to have little clusters of infants' graves around the edges of the site. And we found something earlier on this week that I think demonstrates that very nicely. These are fragments of an infant's legs and skull. Out of our population of 124 individuals, about 30% are infants. This is extraordinarily high, so it's really interesting to have that, and we had to start questioning why.
What's also unusual about this site is that the team has been finding a large number of high-status female burials.
In this space here, in 2011, we excavated grave 57. This is an adult woman, and one of the first ones that we found that year. She was a wealthy burial, buried with a large cruciform brooch at her neck, two smaller ones at her shoulders, and a full set of beads and purse. What was really interesting about her is that in her pelvic area we found a whole series of very, very small bones. And it turns out that these were an infant. She was pregnant when she was buried, and this was probably the cause of death. A really tragic story, but a very interesting piece of the puzzle.
A surprising find. But this was only the tip of the iceberg for Duncan and his team.
In 2012, we had a large trench just where I'm standing now, and excavating just here, we found a woman buried with a complete cow. Now that's a completely unique find. We haven't found anything like that in the whole of northwestern Europe for the 6th century AD. It's really interesting because the cow has cut marks across its lower feet, which suggests that it was skinned. It also had no tailbones at all. So this is not a romantic bovine burial with a furry, cosy animal in their pet, but rather it's a sacrificial offering, a meat gift placed in the grave so that she could host parties in the next world.
Wow, what an incredible find. What did you make of that, Duncan?
It was incredible. We didn't expect it at all. We got very excited because you don't find large animals with women. And I don't know of another example in England. I don't know of another example from the early Middle Ages in Europe at all. So it's unique at this point.
So how does that burial there fit in with all the other female burials that you have in the cemetery?
OK, so that one is mid-6th century. And it's probably got a little mound over the top of it and a whole load of burials all the way around it. And it becomes a central focus point. And we have a number of other similar burials like that, without the cow, of quite important female burials which seem to be focal points throughout the cemetery. And so it's a succession of important women that were part of that 6th century community at Oakington.
So what did you find this year? Let's take a look.
This is an adult female. You can tell from the shape of the pelvis here, but also from the skull shape as well. What's sort of interesting about this one is that this yellow pipe here has been drilled through the grave from a different position, and the people that put it here never saw it. This is part of the services for Oakington Village, as we're right up against the road. So this is often where lots and lots of services go through. And it's amazingly lucky that when they put this through, they missed all of the objects that she's been buried with, and did very little damage really to the skeleton. They really couldn't have done that better, even if it was completely accidental.
What's even more intriguing about this grave are the objects buried with the woman. She seems to be of high status.
We have here a small long brooch that would have been worn on her shoulder, and there's another one on her shoulder just here to hold up her dress. And then this large one would have been on a large cloak, and this is face down. So it would have almost certainly have been wrapped up in the cloak and then rolled on the top of the burial. So it's really interesting that the positions of the objects there can tell us how she was dressed. And almost certainly she was wrapped up in a cloak before the soil was placed in the grave.
So what you've got is an Anglo-Saxon cemetery with a large proportion of women, and a large proportion of women who appear to be very high status, and a lot of infants as well, compared with other cemeteries. What's going on?
That's right. So, proportionally, we have almost all of our female burials are furnished, whereas only a small handful of our male burials are furnished. So they are signifying, or they're making a point of the female burials much more than they are the male burials.
Meaning that all the females were buried with combs, beads...
Exactly, and the brooches on the shoulders and at the neck there as well. But then with all those infants buried in groups around the female burials or on the edge of the cemetery, that population is too high. And so what we're thinking at the moment is that we have a female-dominated matriarchal group, and their daughters are going out and marrying other communities. But potentially, that's quite a scary thing. You're going to a new place, a masculine place, and it's a bit scary to give birth. So they're maybe travelling back, and they're bringing their children back to their mother's hall, to their sister's hall, and they're giving birth there. Now, I don't know whether we can see that archaeologically, but certainly what we can see is those connections, those relationships, and that's why this is a central place in the Cambridgeshire landscape.
So cemeteries like this are not just telling us about individuals, they're giving us information about the structure of society at the time.
Absolutely. The structure of society, its organisation, the movement of people across quite wide areas as well. We're not talking about walking around the corner, we're talking about travelling for some miles to come to this community for this sort of activity.
And the first cow in an Anglo-Saxon grave.
And have you finished the cemetery now, is that it?
We've excavated as much as we possibly can. Yeah, so that's the end now excavation. All of it is now post-excavation, and we hope to understand more and really question some of these things in much more detail.
To get a sense of the wealth and high status of these Anglo-Saxon women, there's no place better than Norwich Castle Museum. It's a treasure trove of bronze, silver and gold. Like this Anglo-Saxon bracteate or pendant.
The particularly important thing about bracteates is that when they've been found in Britain, they've only been found in female graves or as single stray finds. But the particular focus of this is as a hoard. It's the first time this has ever been seen in Britain, whereas normally in Scandinavia, where these bracteates are typically found, they're buried in hoards.
I mean, the workmanship on these is absolutely incredible. But what do these show us?
Well, bracteates are ultimately derived from coin designs, Roman coin designs, because coins would have been worn as pendants themselves. And ultimately, the design became copied, and the copy became copied, and so on, until you end up with a very basic design. And on this bracteate, you can see a warrior with a sword raised behind his back, fighting off two animals.
So what kind of women would have worn these bracteates? I mean, they're solid gold. They look pretty expensive to me.
They are expensive, and therefore it's a sign that the person wearing them is of high status themselves. And from another point of view, it also says something about the person or people that were able to bury an entire hoard of these in the ground to give them up and not come back for them.
This summer, archaeologists have been digging in Kent, looking at what they suspect is a royal palace complex, just the sort of place where people would have been wearing all of that Anglo-Saxon finery. Leminge in southern Kent is now a peaceful English village. But in Anglo-Saxon times, this was a bustling royal centre. For the last 3 years, right in the heart of the village green, dig director Gabor Thomas and his team have uncovered evidence of medieval life and Bronze Age burials, but what they really want are signs of Anglo-Saxon royalty.
Right, it's a lovely rim fragment.
And they're beginning to find clues to personal wealth and status.
So this is a bit of metalwork that came up yesterday. It's a small piece of copper alloy, and it's in the shape of a bird. It's decorated on both sides, which is quite interesting. This is just a hint of what's likely to come once we start excavating into the features.
I thought it was modern, and then I was like, no wait, what? Yeah.
I don't think we've ever had that's so recognisable like that with the base.
So we don't get a lot of bases at all of glass. It's a quite large fragment anyway for a piece of glass. We usually get rims and bits of the body, but not the bases, really.
The team believes these glass fragments were once part of elaborate drinking vessels, like these replicas. But more importantly, they were used by high-status Anglo-Saxons, possibly even Kentish kings. And what they're uncovering now could be the proof they need that kings were here.
We've had a really good breakthrough today in this particular trench where we're looking at an exposure of around about 20 metres. So this building's about probably in excess of 20 metres in length. We've also got a width for it somewhere around 10 metres in width. That's a super-sized hall for the Anglo-Saxon period. You only get these scale halls on royal palace complexes.
So, Garbo, you really think you have found an Anglo-Saxon royal hall?
Without doubt. I mean, the structural evidence says that very clearly. You only get buildings on this scale, on this type of site, and it's worth saying that this is incredibly rare archaeology. Only 2 other sites of this period and this importance have previously been excavated, including the iconic site of Yevering in Northumbria. It was the first place that open-area excavations were undertaken in the 1950s. But normally these sites are found through aerial photography. They show up as crop marks. But on this site, it didn't even show up on geophysics. It required really open-area excavation from the start, and really some small clues that there might be something of this magnitude just under the village green.
So what were the clues that made you dig there?
Well, there was a documentary reference that describes Lyminge as a royal ville or a royal complex, but none of the archaeology relating to that earlier period have ever been found before. And that's what we hoped we would find under the village green, and we hit the jackpot. It was amazing.
And as well as this amazing royal hall, you found an extraordinary rubbish dump. Right next to the 7th century royal hall, the team opened up another area after geophys revealed a mysterious blob. This turned out to be a midden or rubbish dump with incredibly rare finds deep within it. Archaeologist Alex Knox explains.
Today we have begun excavating what we call the dark blob in Trench 1, which is full of Anglo-Saxon artefacts. And we're also hoping to find out if there's anything lying underneath this dump of rubbish.
As the team dig into the midden, high-status finds start coming thick and fast. They uncover decorative brooches.
Yeah, it's in perfect mint condition.
Amazing.
Well done.
Bronze hairpins.
It's an absolute monster. Is that the end? That is the point, yeah.
And a copper alloy mount.
Probably would have been attached to perhaps a leather belt around the second half of the 6th century.
These Anglo-Saxon fashion accessories predate the royal hall by a full century. A very early insight into the culture of this settlement. But the next finds begin to reveal something quite different.
I've seen metalworking residues, iron tools and implements.
It looks relatively modern, actually.
It does.
Probably isn't that modern at all.
And as the metal finds grow, the team begins to suspect there's more to this dump than meets the eye. So they dig a trench right through the middle to investigate.
What's appeared at this level very clearly for us is an area of burning, or what archaeologists would call a hearth. We've also got consolidated lumps of what's likely to be the superstructure or the dome over a furnace or a kiln, showing up nicely on this side of the trench. This evidence here fits very nicely with the materials that have been dumped in above this level. We've recovered a lot of smelting slag. So we have an early Anglo-Saxon version, if you like, of a metalworking installation, of which we've only got one other example, really, from Anglo-Saxon England, which is 2 centuries later. So this is hugely significant archaeology. Now we've got to try and refine our understanding of what's going on in here a bit better by the end of the season.
So, Gabor, this is some of the earliest evidence we have for metalworking then in Anglo-Saxon Britain.
That's right, and there's different types of metalworking as well. So we've got ironworking represented, but also in front of us here is a selection of objects associated with bronze casting. We've got a fragment of a 2-piece mould just here.
What object do you think that would have been?
Probably a piece of jewellery. It may have been something like a bronze buckle or perhaps even a brooch.
So they were really churning out this really high-status bling jewellery, if you like, here.
That's right.
But that's not all you had from the midden, is it, really? Alex, what have you got over there?
We're just washing some of the animal bone that's come out of the midden. Just endless amounts of feasting debris, cattle, sheep, pig, enormous amounts of animal bone to go along with all this metalworking.
So you've got these myriad finds from the midden. What does it all mean?
Well, we have a really interesting association here between feasting on the one hand, as represented by our animal bone, and all of our glass vessels. I think what this represents is a period when specialised manufacture of high-status objects is happening within the sphere of elite residences. And we haven't previously seen that on other sites. This is very new.
So it's really adding as well to our knowledge of the whole of Anglo-Saxon Britain, really?
Absolutely. It's telling us what elite culture was like in this period and its intimate relationship with the production of luxury items.
So once again, archaeology reveals an unexpected twist. A beautiful royal residence, and right next door, making their very own luxury goods, a very early Anglo-Saxon factory. Next, we head to Basing House, a place synonymous with battle and bloodshed. Basing House in Hampshire was a key site in the Civil War. It was a royalist stronghold, and the parliamentarians were keen to take it.
And this year, archaeologists have been digging up evidence of the house's bloody history, bringing us face to face with one of English history's most controversial characters.
In the 16th century, Basing House was one of the most impressive Tudor complexes in the country. It was built on a Norman fort, known as the Old House. And right next to it used to sit a huge mansion, known as the New House. This is where the team have put in a large trench.
It's actually a fantastic archaeological site to work on. We took off the topsoil and the walls started to emerge almost immediately.
Documents of the time tell of a final battle that took place here in 1645, and the team are looking for hard evidence as to just how this mighty fortress fell. Heading up the dig is Chris Elmer.
So we're midway through the dig and we're finding quite a lot of evidence now of the Tudor range that lies behind us. And what we're interested in is thinking about what happened in the Civil War with the destruction of the house. And in fact, recently we've found some pretty interesting evidence because we've got really nice sort of lead musket balls showing us balls that obviously were available as the ammunition of the day. But more intriguingly, we're also finding the evidence for musket balls that have impacted. They've obviously hit something or someone because they've splatted and they've gone into this very strange shape. So we've got a theory that what we're looking at is the evidence of the conflict that was occurring, the battle that was occurring, and we're finding the real evidence of that with these musket balls and with the end product you're seeing here.
2 years before Basing House fell, it was placed under siege by the parliamentarians as they fought the royalists, led by John Paulet, the Marquis of Winchester. Over 2 years of digging, Chris and his team have mapped out the defensive lines of the now vanished Great House.
As we're walking round the site of Basing House, we've just come to the gun platform, and there were several gun platforms erected during the Civil War. This one, we've got a replica of a Civil War saker, a cannon, which will be pointing out towards the parliamentary lines on the other side. There were several gun platforms all the way around the ringwork area, and in a sense, this was the first line of defence during the Civil War for Basing House.
By surveying the surviving buildings of the Great Tudor complex, the team has also identified battle damage.
We've now come inside the Great Barn. I think the most amazing example of destruction, if you like, that we can see, where there would have been cannonballs coming through the roof and then actually hitting the inside of the wall. So we can see there's a great big scar in the wall at the top there. There's another one further along.
With Charles I supplying men and money for the house's fortification, it seemed invincible. And after 2 years of trying to batter Basing House into submission, the parliamentarians were getting nowhere.
So, Alan, who did they turn to?
Well, the Lord General Fairfax sent down his second-in-command, a man who might be quite familiar to you. Here he is, Lieutenant General Oliver Cromwell.
Ah, the man himself.
This is a life mask of Oliver that was done a few years after the siege of Basing House. As you can see, somewhat plumper than a serving soldier would have been in those days, but it does give you a really good impression of what he looked like.
So if this is a life mask, this is a mould of his actual face?
Indeed, that's Oliver. You see, the eyes are rather odd because they were applied afterwards, because obviously he would have had his eyes shut when
It's extraordinary and slightly weird. I still don't think that Oliver Cromwell on his own could have conquered Basing House, so what did he bring with him?
He had a bit of help. He had 3 regiments of foot, several regiments of cavalry, about 5,000 or 6,000 men in actual fact, and some really big guns, including an incredibly big piece of artillery, a cannon royal. That fires a 64-pound ball, and here's an illustration which gives you some idea of the size of the thing. And because of the condition of the roads, sometimes it would take up to 60 horses to pull these down the road, or 60 oxen. Once this was applied against the castle, it doesn't really stand a chance.
So this is bigger than any of the cannon that were actually in Basing House?
Oh, yes, much bigger, yes.
I would not like to have been a royalist facing up against that cannon. So how did they fare?
Well, I think that's what the archaeologists are about to find out.
The new house guarded the entrance to the postern gate, the way into the citadel of Basing House. The team believed that this was the weak point for Cromwell to exploit, and he would have thrown everything he had at the Tudor range, including the firing power of his massive cannon royal. In the last week of the dig, they find evidence to support their theory when they uncover the remains of a bridge which connected the new house to the old.
The postern gate that led into the old house is directly behind us, and this area that we're excavating was part of the entry point for the old house. And what we're thinking is this is the point where in the Civil War the parliamentarians broke through into the old house. And so, can we see anything there that tells us about that final battle? Can we see anything that tells us about their entry to the old house as well?
Previously on this same site, archaeologists uncovered several skeletons around Basing House, which they believe were defenders from the Civil War. But the most significant discovery was the remains of one particular soldier, found by the postern gate, who seems to have died defending this weak spot in the final siege.
To our surprise, after we'd finished excavating the gateway and had a narrow passageway, we saw there was a ditch which we sectioned, and in that ditch we found a skull which had been decapitated. There were some of the vertebrae were there in situ, and there was also a great sword cut on top of the cranium. And so that had to be really the head of one of the defenders of Basing, and as such really must have got there during that final assault on 14th of October 1645. And it's so rare for an archaeologist to be able to find something and say, this happened on this particular day, but we feel confident that that was the case there.
Of the 400 royalists defending Basing House, 100 were slain and the rest taken prisoner, while the great Tudor mansion itself was set on fire.
People could hear the cries of those who'd taken refuge in the cellars, screaming to be let out. But there was no one to let them out. There was no way of reaching them, and so a good number must have perished in that way.
Finally, Cromwell's brutal attack had led to a decisive victory, and he quickly sent word back to London. "I thank God I can give you a good account of Basing. We have had little loss, many of the enemy our men put to the sword. Most of the rest we have prisoners, amongst whom the Marquis of Winchester himself. Your most humble servant, Oliver Cromwell. Archaeology is a complex jigsaw puzzle, drawing together everything from skeletons to swords, and from riches to royalty. Amazing stories which are helping to rewrite our history. This is Digging for Britain, the programme which brings you this year's most outstanding new archaeology. All year, in hundreds of digs across the UK, teams have been uncovering new archaeological clues which help us to tell our story. Hey! We'll be looking at highlights from all the digs with in-depth analysis from archaeologists who are going to extraordinary lengths to uncover our history in a way that only archaeology can.
And they've been out there filming themselves to make sure that we were there for every moment of discovery.
It's in perfect mint condition.
Amazing.
And they'll be joining us back here at the Dorset County Museum to help us make sense of what the new finds actually mean.
Tonight we're in the west of England as we meet army veterans on the hunt for Anglo-Saxon warriors. We investigate Britain's earliest leprosy hospital, changing what we know about how sufferers might have been treated. And we reveal a lost Roman masterpiece. We're in Dorchester, home to the Dorset County Museum, established in 1845, and famous for housing the study and notebooks of one of England's most well-loved writers, Thomas Hardy. But it's also home to some of our most important treasures, like the Chickerell rings, these Bronze Age gold torques discovered by metal detectorists. And the Langton Matravers axes, the largest hoard of Bronze Age axes ever discovered in Britain, and which some believe were made as a gift to the gods. In our first dig, just 50 miles away from the museum, more extraordinary Bronze Age remains are coming to light at Barrow Clump in the heart of Salisbury Plain. Over the last 3 years, archaeologists from the Ministry of Defence, who owns the land, have been excavating a Bronze Age burial site. This ancient site dates back to over 5,000 years ago, but archaeologists have been called in now because it's in danger. Badgers are burrowing through the soil, destroying the archaeology, so the team must hurry to recover and record as much as possible. And after only 2 days on site, their work pays off with an important discovery, a Bronze Age burial urn, so fragile that its temporary protection is a bucket.
There you go. It's really, really exciting, this. You can see the rim of the pot all coming around here, and within it, bits of collapsed pot, but all this burnt material, which we presume is burnt human bone. And we'll lift it out as a block and we'll excavate that back in the lab, but it's a fantastic find.
Having gently excavated the urn, osteoarchaeologist Jacqueline McKinley carefully lifts the collar.
Voila! Like doing a sponge cake. Yeah. If I lift that up, can you see all that lovely cord decoration on the inside of there? Yeah. Brilliant, isn't it?
No sooner has the first urn been rescued, but a second vessel is found. This much larger urn has been buried upside down.
It is moving though, isn't it? I'm just worried.
After a tense hour, the urn comes out in one piece, carefully bandaged.
It's actually a food vessel, Bronze Age food vessel, which I know looks like a bandaged head at the moment. The reason that bandage is there is because it's slightly elasticated, so it gives support to the vessel and stops it falling apart while I'm getting things from inside it.
And Jackie, you're in the process of looking at this material, I think from the first urn, the urn with the cord marking on it.
That's right. This was actually quite badly damaged on site. It was only about sort of 10 centimetres left. So I decided in this case to excavate what was inside it on site. And today actually is the first time I've seen this. Now it's been washed and cleaned up again.
And at this point, what can you tell about this bone?
Well, what I've done is I've pulled out some very useful pieces of bone, like, for instance, this here, which is part of the superorbit, which goes about there.
Yeah.
And there's a few other pieces around here, like, for instance, this one, which is from there,
yeah, but it's
which is part of the zygomatic arch. The skull is very useful, one, in that you have very easily identifiable pieces of bone which you only either have one or a pair of. So they're very useful for doing minimum numbers of individuals. But also a lot of the skull is very diagnostic in terms of sexing the individual, the adult individual.
And what about the sex of this individual? Is this an adult male or female?
Looking at the general size and robusticity, I would say it's most likely to be male.
And do you think these were high-status individuals that were treated in this way and buried in the barrows?
Status, well, you know, in the past, the antiquarians always thought that everybody was a chieftain. It was always chieftains. It was always chieftains, always men, always chieftains who were buried in here.
So this would have been a king?
It would have been a king, yes, undoubtedly, or a prince or something. But when you actually look at the individuals you find in these places, they are a mix of individuals. You could get males, females, children. And one of the things that I have noticed when I've been looking at material from these barrows is that you have quite a large number of females with infants or young children. Now, if you think about your community and what matters to a community, one of the important things there is the future. And your future is your children. So really, the children and the mother that produces the children, could be seen as very important to the community. So it's not really surprising that they're quite often chosen to be buried in these positions.
But these urns aren't the only things which make this dig special. In a unique project known as Operation Nightingale, the MOD archaeologists are working closely with injured soldiers for whom this is vital therapy. This pioneering scheme is introducing veteran armed forces personnel to the practice of archaeology.
Operation Nightingale is really a recovery opportunity. Some of them will want to, having had maybe a tough operational tour, will want to just come out and experience a very benign atmosphere. You can see how it's quite cathartic in the broadest sense, that you can come out here, be with your friends, and just get to understand a little bit about the past landscapes over which you've trained over many years.
For many men, like former rifleman Kenny Kendrick, it's been a lifesaver.
What happened to me is I suffered a mental breakdown while over in Germany, and it's given me a whole new lease of life, a new career. Yeah, I left the army and I've become an archaeologist full-time. And once I start digging, it's very hard to stop. If I'm not told when to take a break, when to have a drink, when to have a dinner, then I'll probably dig until it gets dark.
In fact, the disciplines of the military and archaeology are not such strange bedfellows.
Anyone who's watched the news footage from Afghanistan or Iraq has seen people, military figures, looking for IEDs and things like that with a metal detector. Critical skill in the military, key skill on an archaeological site.
Just do that area again quickly.
It's almost a symbiotic relationship in many ways. There are so many crossover skills, and it's quite an inspirational thing for the archaeologists amongst us to see that and working together as a team, and it's a team thing that's crucial.
As its name suggests, Barrow Clump is a barrow or burial mound, so it's no surprise that the team uncover skeletons.
He was a very large bloke. These femurs are truly huge. And his feet are the toe bones. I've never seen anything so big.
As burial after burial appears, they soon realise they're unearthing an Anglo-Saxon cemetery dating from the 6th century AD, just a few metres away from the original Bronze Age burial site.
There's huge progress on site. We started off with 1 or 2 grave cuts that we could see, and over the weeks we've now exposed at least 12. There we go.
Like this spearhead and shield boss, the metal centre of a shield which would have protected the hand. The original shield could have been up to 1 metre in diameter. These are warriors' graves. But with so many on site, the team are beginning to wonder why.
One of the theories that was put forward to me by one of the soldiers on the project was that the outside of the ditch seemed to have quite a large concentration of males with shields, and thought that this was perhaps something like an equivalent in death of the Saxon shield wall protecting those buried inside the monument, which I think is a really lovely idea.
So it is interesting to have all those Anglo-Saxon burials alongside the Bronze Age ones, but is it unusual?
No, there's quite a lot of evidence that Anglo-Saxons would choose what were obvious, important, particularly mortuary important, landscape features in which to bury their own dead. These would have been very obvious features at that time. The mounds would have been quite obvious there, and people would have recognised that they were very important to people in the past. And in a way, the same way as in the Bronze Age, they were probably almost staking a claim in that landscape by producing these mounds. The Anglo-Saxons, by coming in and burying their dead there, may also have been staking a claim to the same land.
Well, in spite of a growing number of warrior graves at Barrow Clump, there's still one thing that's eluding the team.
The chap in front of us has between his knees the remnants of an iron shield boss, and that's one of several we've now had over the site. To the left of the individual, just poking out above the grave, is the socket of a spear. So, all those things that you'd expect perhaps to find with a warrior. What we're missing from that, and something you see referred to throughout Saxon poetry, is a sword.
Swords were prized by the Saxons, but are extremely rare finds. Richard's greatest hope is that they'll find one, but despite unearthing 75 graves, the prize is proving elusive. However, the badgers burrowing on this site have left a trail that leads the team right to this year's prize find.
As we were going down, we had a lot of badger packing material, so we weren't sure whether they would have disturbed any remains that were there. As it happens, we do have a badger run that does run right alongside and has damaged the skeleton, but the rest of it is very well preserved. And we're very lucky, in fact, that we've got a sword lying alongside it. So this one's got the big three, really, and it's got the spearhead, the shield boss, and then a sword alongside.
Now all they have to do is get the sword out. An extremely delicate task, carried out by Lynn Wootton, conservator with Wessex Archaeology.
It's a sword which is sitting right on the top arm bone, which is coming out in fragments. I'm going to try and get the whole lot up in one go.
If the sword survives excavation, the trick will be to find out if it's pattern welded. This was a complicated method of forging a blade to produce a top-class sword. A clue, perhaps, to the man who was buried with it.
We're thrilled to be joined by Richard and some of his colleagues from the medical squadron here this evening, and we're especially lucky because we're going to X-ray the sword in real time right here in the museum. But before we do that, Richard, what can you tell us about it?
We're really excited about this because this was the only sword we had, and it was found by one of the soldiers of the project, so really, really exciting. And what we really want to know is to see whether it is one of those fabulous high-status weapons that's pattern-welded and really part of the whole mythology of Anglo-Saxon England, of the sword with its name and that sort of thing. It's a powerful item.
And this came out of the ground in one piece, didn't it?
It did, and it was a nervous moment having this thing lifted Excalibur-like from the ground.
Somebody take it, the two hands. There you go. It's not touching very well, so it's... Oh, lots of mineralised wood. You want some bag?
So yes, a real thing of beauty, and the sword being such an important artefact in the 6th century, this was really quite a thrill to find it.
So what we've got, I mean, this is the handle end, obviously, and is there bits of copper along here?
That's right. You've got the remnants of the scabbard, and perhaps you can make out little traces of mineralised wood, which is the fabric of the scabbard. And these are the gilded copper alloy mounts at the side of the scabbard. Same with the top area. It might have some decorations. The X-ray will hopefully show us that. And then perhaps you can see some elements of the horn handle that was here in its 6th century guise.
So that's been mineralised as well. So is there an iron core running through the middle of that then?
Yeah. That again will pick up on the X-ray.
And have you cleaned it up at all, or is this just as it came out of the ground?
This is subject to immediate stabilisation, so it doesn't deteriorate, and then the full conservation will happen after the event.
Brilliant. Well, I think we should probably let Sergeant McDougall and Sergeant Barnett get on with the X-rays. We need to clear while they do that.
Yeah.
Wow, look at that. That's come out beautifully, hasn't it, Richard?
Well, this is fantastic, because you can see all the things we really wanted to see. Of course, the thing that you really think of a sword in this period is whether it's pattern welded or not, and that was the real question we wanted to answer. And the answer is yes, it is, which is fantastic.
So how can you tell that then?
Can you see all these little sort of zigzags in here? Can you see there's a sort of crisscross element right in the middle of the blade up here? That's really indicative of these 3 bars of iron that have been twisted and twisted to form, well, it's a debate at the moment as to whether that's for strength or for decoration, but it certainly would have been very beautiful, a bit like a herring, you know, one of these fish, a beautiful decorated thing.
And we see that in samurai swords as well,
It's exactly
don't we?
the same thing, because it's a strengthening thing, and you can see how perhaps making out the white lines going down the sword, can you all see that? See that? That's the actual edge of the sword, where this pattern welding goes on, and then the hardened steel edges are on the side there.
So that's when it starts to bevel out towards the cutting
That's
edge.
right, and so you've got a thing of beauty, but a thing with a real purpose to it. These aren't just prestigious objects for no reason, they're also things that can actually kill.
It's great to be able to see all that without actually having to start taking that soil
It's
off
fabulous.
it.
It's a non-intrusive way of finding an awful lot of data and information about the artefact without rendering it fragile and vulnerable, really.
OK, so who was the man who had this artefact then?
That's a very good question. He had not only this, he had a shield with him, he had a spear, and he had a knife. So he's got more or less the panoply of arms going into the grave. He's right in the most important part of the burial mound, so he must have been somebody with a degree of power and wealth. This isn't an everyday item, as I said. It's the only one we've had out of the 75 burials. So he's an important man.
The soldiers believe that the owner of this sword might have been a local king or warrior chief who was buried surrounded by the burials of other warriors and placed in the ground with his spear, shield and sword. This find close to a Bronze Age cemetery contributes both to our understanding of Anglo-Saxon burials and shows how they reused earlier monuments for their cemeteries. But there's another group of warrior dead here at the Dorset Museum who are central to a long-running debate. For years, historians have argued whether the Romans invaded Britain or staged a peaceful takeover. So Rebecca, Maiden Castle is famous because it's a really beautiful hill fort, but also for the cemetery that's up there.
Exactly. There is what has become known as the Wall Cemetery at the eastern end of the hill fort, yeah.
And these are 2 of the skeletons from that cemetery?
Yeah. These 2 are very, very special young chaps because they are the ones that contain the most unique evidence that we have that enables us to pin this cemetery down to AD 43.
So let's have a look at these 2 then. I mean, I can immediately see something which looks a bit suspicious.
Yes.
Which is, and it's got an arrow pointing to it as well.
I know, it's very helpful.
Which is this, this bolt here. Oh, I'm just going to move this vertebra out. so that we can have a good look at it. Look at that. Well, that's amazing.
It is, I mean, and it's actually embedded into the bone, so it's passed through that individual and lodged in their vertebra.
Is that a typical Roman weapon there?
It is, it's a classic Roman ballista bolt, and that's how we can date these burials. So we know that although the individuals, the pottery that they're buried with is late Iron Age, that absolutely dates them to the Roman invasion, because none of those weapons are here before the Romans get here.
So it's coming in like this. Right through the guts, through the kidney, in fact, and grazing the vertebra and coming right to the back here. So that's enough to kill somebody?
Yeah, absolutely. But there is more. So very obviously, this young chap here has got a rather large hole in his head. So that's where he's been bashed on the head.
Yeah.
And then these lines, you only get the fracture lines running off in these directions if it's something that's happened at the time of death. And then it kind of gets worse for this guy, because then this very little nick here, and that's out of the back of his mandible. And that's where someone with a sword then tried to cut his head off.
Right, okay.
And then they've had another go, because he's then got this blow which has actually peeled off the bone on his mandible here.
Nasty.
Yeah, so they've tried to cut his head off twice.
He's really been hacked, hasn't he? I mean, this is vicious, this is violent, and it's not...
Yeah.
It's not just one piece of evidence of violence. I mean, you know, shock and awe at its worst.
It is very, very shocking. So the Roman army are going above and beyond what is necessary to kill someone. But we know that when they are conquering new territories, they really did go and decimate people.
These skeletons graphically reveal one side of the story of the Romans' arrival in Britain. But in 2011, I visited a site in North Dorset which told a different story, the Dura-Trigger's Big Dig project. For several years, archaeologists have been digging at Winterbourne, Kingston. The dig originally started as an Iron Age exploration, looking back almost 2,000 years to when members of the Dura-Trigger's tribe lived and farmed here before the Romans arrived.
Well, this survey of the site, which is a magnetic survey, shows us the Iron Age ditched enclosure we call a banjo enclosure. That's because it superficially resembles a banjo with the body and the neck.
And do you think this was a defensive enclosure?
Not at all. Not at all. This is effectively an undefended farmstead.
But as the team continued the dig, they started to turn up more and more signs of Romanisation influencing the lives of the local inhabitants.
So we've also got pieces of chicken, and of course, you know, we're familiar with chicken today, but in the late Iron Age, this is an exotic animal. This is coming in from the Roman world. Presumably they're selling their produce, they're selling their grain, and they're getting these kind of luxury food items in return. This particular fragment is the handle of an amphora, a large sort of storage vessel that would have stood up to the height of an adult. And we can tell by the fabric and by the shape that it's from Spain, and it would have probably held wine.
That's lovely.
It is, so we can imagine that, you know, they're eating chicken, they're drinking wine, they're sort of plugged into the Mediterranean world.
So for these Iron Age farmers, life with the Romans appears to have been a peaceful coexistence, in stark contrast to the massacre at Maiden Castle. You don't see evidence of a really abrupt transition at your side, do you?
No, I mean, you can't really tell when the Romans arrived, because there's small amounts of Roman material coming in the 1st century BC. As we go on to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century AD, there's still equivalent amounts of Roman pottery. It's all very low-level stuff. There's no sudden break when the Romans arrived. There's no change, there's no dramatic increase in Roman artefacts. And we're seeing that right the way across Dorset. I think, like Native American societies, they're picking and choosing a few things that help facilitate their lifestyle. But there's no major change in settlement or religion going on. It takes 300 years after the invasion before we start seeing real significant Roman material like villas and temples being created. There's a big time lag between the arrival of the Romans and their final sort of evolution of Roman culture.
I think the main thing is that the picture that we're used to is too simple, isn't it? It's much more complex.
It is. You get this black and white idea. The Romans arrive, those who they don't kill end up living in villas and towns straight away. it takes 3 centuries for that kind of Roman culture to really take a hold in this part of Britain.
So you've been digging at this site now, Miles, for quite a few seasons. How's the picture been changing over the years?
It's been changing quite a lot because we started out with an Iron Age settlement. We're looking at that transition from Iron Age to Roman, and what we're finding is evidence going on a good sort of 3 centuries afterwards. So we're doing a geophysical survey around the whole area, but we're finding more evidence of later Roman material.
And I think a couple of your more plucky students filmed this year's dig for us, didn't they?
Absolutely,
as it unfolded.
Yes.
We're in day 3 in Trench 1 at the top end of the site, and the cleaning back has revealed exactly what we were hoping to find, really, which is we've got this very sort of large, it's about 15 metres across, square enclosure, defined by a very sort of thin ditch, and the interior of which there's a whole series of small pits and other features. It could be a shrine, it could be a temple, it could be none of the above, it could be some kind of animal agricultural enclosure, but until we start going down into it we're not going to know. But it's a very nice distinct feature and it fits beautifully in the trench, and once again, because it's dug down in the chalk, it shows up fantastically.
Miles and his students are hoping that this find will yield clues about the people who lived here. Were they farmers who adopted Roman ways, or were they Romans from elsewhere in the empire?
Okay, so it's the beginning of day 7, and we're quite excited that inside the square enclosure in Trench 1 there's 4 rectangular cuts which look extremely like graves.
This is the team's first major clue as to who might have lived here.
So we just started cleaning up these rectangular cuts, and they have actually, thankfully, started turning up into graves. We were wondering to begin with, because these were east-west aligned, whether they were going to turn out to be Christian burials. But the heads are at the eastern end. If they were Christian, you'd expect them to be at the other end. So sort of facing sunrise on the Day of Judgment. We've got a skull coming up here, and we've also got just part of a pottery vessel coming up at the other end.
So these are unlikely to be Christian graves, and neither do they appear to be Iron Age, as in this area, those tend to take the form of a crouched burial. The expectation is that they are Roman, because in 2013, just in the next field, they excavated a late 4th century Roman villa. After another day's digging, the team begin to find strong evidence of a connection as more skeletons start to appear.
You can see just here in this particular grave, we've got not only have we got 1 coffin nail coming up here, so we know that these individuals are all in coffins, which is probably another indicator that they're not early Christian, which tend to be buried in shrouds. But we've also got a spindle whirl, which is another little nice object they're taking with them into the afterlife. And quite a lot of late Roman female burials have spindle whirls buried with them. I don't know whether that's an activity they would have done in life. And one of the other cuts that's been excavated, we've had hobnails coming up, little nails that are hammered into sandals and Roman footwear, suggesting that they're going into the grave wearing almost military-style boots. So at the moment we can say that these are Roman, they are almost certainly late Roman. And the provisional evidence at present suggests they are contemporary with the villa, which is what we're hoping for, to try and find a link with villa occupants and the house they actually occupied.
Just a day later, Miles and the team uncover 3 female and 2 male skeletons.
Well, it's the end of day 9. Things are going extremely well. The square barrow in Trench 1 is turning out rapidly to become what appears to be a family mausoleum. We've now got at least 5 graves in there. What looks like 1 immature, 1 sort of juvenile character, and 4 adults. None of which appear to be Christian, all of which at the moment seem to have indication of grave goods.
It was traditional for Romans to bury goods with their dead, like footwear or pottery. Like this bowl they found in one of the female graves.
Hopefully we'll start to get all those out and get a better idea of their date, still hoping that they are the occupiers of the villa that we excavated last year.
If they can get an accurate date for the pot, it will give the team an even better idea of who these people were. So, Miles, when do these burials that you've just been finding date to?
Well, that's the question. The pot that comes out with them, this particular vessel, we know is made sometime about 370, 380 AD. But the question is, how old is it at the time it's gone into the grave?
Yeah, that's lovely. It's got imprinted pattern on it.
It's got this little rosette pattern all the way around. But you can see it's very worn. The slip's worn off. And it originally had a base. It has had a foot on it, which is broken off. And it's been worn smooth. And given it may have taken 40, 50, 60 years before it's actually ended up in the grave. So we're seeing people who've been buried in a Roman-style tradition, but they haven't got access to high-status Roman goods. I suspect, given that we've only got a few bits of spindle whorls, we've got fragments of pottery, there's not a lot of Roman status goods going in with these graves. I think we're dealing with a sub-Roman population. This is the people who are sort of traditionally grubbing around in the remains of their Roman world.
So do you think this is after the collapse of the Roman Empire then?
I think it is. I think we are dealing with the last people who are still have a remembrance of a Roman world. They're still clinging on to one or two items that link them back to that past, but they're no longer working within a functioning Roman administration. So I think we're really dealing with people who are probably dying and being buried probably sometime in the sort of mid-5th century. So we've probably got 450s ADs. It's probably our cut-off point for the time that these people are going into their graves.
And there is a theory that the bodies at Maiden Castle are the natives who are taking one last stand against the Romans. And is it possible that the bodies you've got and you're excavating are their descendants hundreds of years later?
That would be fantastic if we could prove that, obviously. But if we got good DNA samples from both, then we might be able to say that these are the descendants from the Iron Age inhabitants. And that would be something rather spectacular, because we still don't know yet whether it's the people who live in the villas are the descendants of the indigenous population, or whether they are first-generation or second-generation migrants from another part of the Roman Empire.
The Romano-Britons who lived and died in the villa offer clues to the poverty of the twilight world after the Roman army left in 410 AD. But less than 100 miles away at Chedworth, another dig is unexpectedly revealing the glories of Roman Britain in its heyday. First discovered by the Victorians 150 years ago, Chedworth is a late 4th century courtyard villa complex. In August, a team of archaeologists from the National Trust started a 2-week dig to find out more about the villa layout. Unfortunately, they had very little recorded information to go on. The last person to dig here was Sir Ian Richmond, Professor of Archaeology at Oxford University, whose notes were lost after his death in 1965. All that remains of his work are some modern concrete path borders which the team believe Richmond laid down to outline a 2nd century Roman bathhouse. But they were in for a surprise, as Martin Papworth explains.
When we started our excavation here, we really thought that Ian Richmond had dug everything, including the wall lines where he put his concrete, and also the bits in between, which we call the islands. So we were quite surprised when we lifted the turf and we found bits of tesserae coming up, bits of mosaic coming up. And there were no records of any mosaics in any of these areas between the walls.
The tesserae, or tile pieces, are revealing what might be a border in red, cream and blue, but whether anything else survives of the central pattern is unclear.
There are areas, there's going to be big holes in it. There's going to be areas where the mosaic have been lost, and Carol's working over here. She's got an edge against the wall, but lots of loose tesserae there in a worn area away from the wall. So we just need to gradually uncover and show what lies within these walls.
There's also something else puzzling the team. They had thought they were working on a series of baths in separate rooms.
The other strange thing is that we've taken the concrete up and we've cleaned underneath the concrete and we're not finding walls yet, which is quite peculiar.
Pretty soon it becomes clear they're no longer dealing with a bathhouse.
We knew from the beginning, when we first lifted the turf, that there was going to be mosaic underneath here. But now we can see it's part of one great long mosaic. In fact, we now believe it's part of the grand reception hall of the villa. So rather than having 5 or 6 little bits of different rooms of mosaic, all this mosaic joins up into one big pattern.
The team make other finds which give more of an idea of the decoration of the villa.
We found bits of wall plaster on top of the topsoil, and in that we've got patterns in red, blue and white, green, and so we must think of this floor as being part of something really grand.
Emerging from the rubble, an extraordinary, huge artwork and an insight into the wealth and power of the Romano-British.
So if we were looking at in terms of did this person consider themselves Roman, were they presenting their life as being part of the great Roman Empire and the whole link to classical civilization, well, there surely must be someone really showing off their wealth and their link to Rome and really presenting themselves as Roman.
The team had started the dig thinking they were looking for a 2nd century bathhouse, and they finished up with a show-stopping grand reception hall. I think it's amazing how much you can find by going back and revisiting existing archaeological sites where you think you know everything already.
Yeah, and find some incredible mosaics. John, how do those mosaics compare to these incredible mosaics that we're literally sitting on right here?
Well, we're very lucky in Dorset that we have an awful lot of mosaics. Over 60 have been found in the county, but in the county museum here we have 12 that have been relocated from around the county, including this one from Derngate Street in the middle of Dorchester.
And what have we got here? I mean, is that a serpent over there?
Yeah, we've got serpents and we've got drinking vessels. The serpents represent rebirth, and that's Bacchus's drinking vessel, so it's good luck and celebration.
So what can these mosaics tell us about the people who owned them or who owned the villas where they were?
Well, the complexity of them and their intricacy suggests they were extremely wealthy. Also, there are things in them that tell us that they want to be part of the wider Roman culture. Their use of mythology, their imagery for the Roman gods and legends all suggests that they really want to identify with Rome.
So were they locals made good, or were they Roman officials who'd moved in?
Well, that's going to be the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it's my own instinct would be it's going to be a combination of the local population who have done well from Roman occupation, from trading with the Romans, and also those officials from Rome who want very grand houses in what was a very important part of Roman Britain.
So these beautiful and intricate mosaics tell us of a vanished Romano-British world when at least some in the West enjoyed the riches of empire. For the past 7 years, a team has been excavating one of the earliest leprosy hospitals near Winchester, dating back almost 1,000 years. And what they've been finding at St Mary Magdalene is really helping to change our ideas about leprosy in the Middle Ages. Just a mile from Winchester city centre, St Mary Magdalene was once a busy complex of buildings. But now, nothing remains above ground. The last recorded medieval building on this site was a late 15th century almshouse. But archaeologists from the University of Winchester have been slowly peeling back an extremely rare medical history. As the dig unfolds, the team is filming it themselves, and in charge is Chief Investigator Simon Roffey.
This is the north wall of that infirmary running across the site. So I'm inside the medieval infirmary now, and as I step outside into this area here, we have evidence of what we think may be the wall of a possible cloister. Last year we found whole pots, metal objects, evidence for perhaps medical practice.
But more importantly, the team have uncovered 20 graves. The condition of the skeletons leads them to believe that there was a leprosy hospital here, dating back to 1070.
It's the earliest excavated leprosy hospital in Britain. The cemetery holds about 85% of individuals with leprosy, men, women, children and babies. It's the highest sample we have from any British site.
In the Middle Ages, it was thought that those with leprosy were unclean and sinful, and that the disease was a punishment from God. In 2011, I went to look at the skeletons they'd uncovered for myself and see the full shocking extent of the disease with osteologist Dr. Katie Tucker. Now this is extreme, isn't it?
Yeah, this is, I suppose you don't know if it's the wrong word to use, the best example of leprosy that we have on the site. Yeah, you can see the massive amounts of bone loss.
Yeah.
I mean, totally lost the front of the nose. You actually see these are the sockets here for the first molars. So all the bone has been lost back to the first molars.
Back to the first molars. That is just horrific, isn't it? I mean, look at that. You've lost all of the front of the upper jaw here and the bottom of the nasal cavity.
And the hard palate, of course, has gone as well.
Yeah.
So it probably would have been quite difficult for this individual to eat without choking.
Yeah. It's quite a shocking disease, isn't it? I mean, I find it shocking to look at it in a skeleton, and I think it's not surprising that it carried such a stigma with it.
I mean, they would have looked alien, really, especially with the facial lesions as well in the soft tissue, and probably would have needed help eating maybe because, well, they may have even had difficulty actually picking things up because they'd started to get loss of feeling in their hands.
Yeah.
So I think they probably would have needed quite a lot of help during the last few years of their life.
Some accounts suggest that those suffering from leprosy would have been outcasts and not given the same treatment as ordinary citizens in life or in death. But back at St Mary Magdalene, the team believes that the graves themselves reveal a very different story.
What we can see here is a grave that's been well cut into the chalk, anthropomorphic, it's tapered down towards the feet end. There's a head niche there to hold the head of the individual, and around the grave you can see the lip, which would hold a lid or a ledger on top of it. You can see that all these graves are well separated, they've been marked as well. So what we're seeing here is a certain level of care and attention that's gone into building these graves.
It's clear that these were no hasty burials. In this religious hospital, people with leprosy seem to have been treated with respect and buried with care. The archaeologists also believe that one particular grave they uncovered back in 2011 supports this idea. This skeleton of a man was discovered buried with a scallop shell, a traditional pilgrim badge that he may have carried back from one of the most famous pilgrimage sites in the world, Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Simon believes that this man proves that medieval leprosy sufferers could be treated with respect and dignity, and not always with revulsion.
This is the shell that we just saw in the VT, the pilgrim's shell.
That's right. This wonderful artefact was from an individual of mature years. He had early-stage leprosy. Clearly took this with him to the grave as a sort of way of proving that he'd done this arduous pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. But I think more widely, this badge tells us about the status of the hospital. I mean, here is a man of religious sensitivity, wealth perhaps, and the means to go on a pilgrimage, and here he is buried in a community of leprosy sufferers. So, I mean, this really challenges this view that we have that leprosy hospitals were somehow excluded from society, the community were outcast, this sort of thing.
But do you think he could have been excluded when he developed the outward signs of leprosy? I mean, he's there in the hospital, he's buried within the hospital cemetery and not with his own community.
I think when we look at the archaeology as a whole, what we have is well-appointed timber buildings originally, got substantial post holes on the site. We have a chapel. We have a well-ordered cemetery. We also got evidence for medical provision on one example. All this put together, I think, tells us that this site wasn't a site of outcasts. These were people who had a certain level of status, I think.
Because there is the traditional view, the medieval view, that leprosy was somehow a sinful disease, but this doesn't appear to be the case.
It's a very complex issue, I think, where we have this, perhaps, belief today that leprosy sufferers were sinful, were outcasts. This has only recently been challenged by certain revisionist historians and also our work at St Mary Magdalene in Winchester.
So it's really important then, because it's showing that these people were looked after.
Certainly, and leprosy is a disease that affects people today in places such as India and Brazil, and among many other countries. There's only about 250,000 new cases of leprosy identified every year. And leprosy is still stigmatised in these countries. So part of what we're doing is really challenging this stigma.
For the Romans, the far west was frontier country, and in the past we believed that they got no further than Exeter. But a dig at Ipplepen in Devon is literally pushing the boundaries of Roman Britain in the west. I visited this site 3 years ago, when it was just a tiny collection of graves and a Roman road. Now it's turning into something much more intriguing.
It looks like it's an adult female. You can see it's got quite a high, straight forehead, which is a feature on females, and quite small arches you can feel on yourself here. You've got quite low ridges and supraorbital ridge. So I think it's an adult female. Got half of the mandible here, which is this part. We've got this side, and all of her teeth, and you can see they're very worn. So all the enamel has actually come off, and we've got the dentine exposed.
The team finds no evidence of the cause of death in this skeleton, but this woman was probably about 30 years old when she died. After some careful excavation, the first Ipplepen resident is off to the University of Exeter for radiocarbon dating.
So it's the end of day 8 and kind of quite an emotional moment, lifting the first skull of the site, and always got to remember you've got to be really respectful that these people were real human beings. That it's just quite amazing to think that they lived here on this site 2,000 years ago, and how different the world must have been then.
By day 12, the team have uncovered another 9 burials and over 2,000 small finds, all adding evidence to their theory that this was a Roman settlement, although some of the objects are a bit of a mystery.
Got quite an interesting find here. Not sure exactly what it is, but I've got a feeling that it might be a cosmetic case with makeup inside. We immediately wrapped it in bandages and packaged it up to be conserved and mucked up. So we'll know more at a later date exactly, precisely what it is.
But what's perhaps the team's biggest clue to a Roman presence is the position of the graves.
Even though it's partially cut into the edge of the road, it is still respecting, generally, the line of the road. It's a roadside burial. It's deliberately placed at the side of the road.
As burials were forbidden in Roman cities, the dead were buried on the outskirts, often along the roadside, just as the team is finding here.
So it's day 18 on our excavations at Ipplepen. We've now got a total of 16 skeletons. So it's quite clear that what we're dealing with here is a Romano-British cemetery, which is very exciting.
It's amazing to see the way this site is developing, because when I visited and we stood on that hill in Ipplepen, all there was a road and a couple of roadside burials, and now you've got a whole cemetery. But what about the road itself? Where does it go?
Don't know yet. I suspect probably from Exeter and out towards South Devon. But it's just really fascinating. We really didn't expect to find such a well-preserved Roman road so far west of Exeter. And we're still only scratching the surface, but this year's excavations have been a real revelation. They really have. And it was just an example of some of the absolutely lovely stuff that we had. This is what was being excavated in the VT.
And is it a powder compact?
We don't know.
Still don't know, come on.
This is a real mystery artefact, actually. Experts have looked at it at the British Museum, and there's a possibility that it might be a lead weight that's been set into a case, into a copper alloy case. But I'm not sure why you would do that, unless perhaps it was a weight that maybe belonged to your grandfather and it was a kind of keepsake or something. So the jury's still out on this mystery artefact. We had hoped that it would be a lady's compact because it's really nice to actually see the female side of Roman Britain.
Yeah. And a beautiful brooch.
A beautiful brooch. And you can see here it's got amazing enamel set into the cells there, and it's even intact with its catch plate and its pin and its spring. I mean, it's such a lovely example, which dates from probably about 75 to 175 AD.
Is that a tiny bead there?
Yeah, we've got beads, we've got coins, we've got hairpins, we've got mystery objects.
And Danny, you came in to our studio here in Dorchester Museum, incredibly exciting. You told us you've got a radiocarbon date.
Yes, and we took the latest burial, which is dug into the roadside ditch of the Roman road. So it's the latest one that we've excavated so far. And the radiocarbon results that have come back as 7th to 8th century.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's a long-running cemetery then?
Absolutely, yeah. It's just absolutely stunning. So we're not just dealing with 1st century Roman stuff going through to the 4th century Romano-British. It's carrying on well into the post-Roman period, and this is so important for Devon and Cornwall.
That is fascinating, and just remember that you heard it here first. We are rewriting the history of the Romans and the Dark Ages in the southwest here on Digging for Britain. From the Anglo-Saxon sword to the cemetery rewriting the history of leprosy, the West has provided us with a richly woven tapestry of our past. Hello and welcome to Digging for Britain, the programme which brings you this year's most outstanding new archaeology. Once again, over the last year, archaeologists were busy unearthing our history in hundreds of digs across Britain. They've gone to extraordinary lengths to uncover long-lost treasures, retelling our story in a way that only archaeology can.
And our archaeologists have been out filming themselves to make sure that we were there for every moment of discovery.
Go on! Fantastic. It's a tooth.
And they'll be joining us back here at the National Museum of Scotland to help us make sense of what these new finds actually mean.
In this series, we'll be touring Britain, and tonight, we're in the north. We discover one of the biggest and best preserved Roman forts in Britain. And we catch the very moment when a Viking boat burial is unearthed. And see how rescue archaeologists are fighting the elements to save a rare Iron Age site. Over 1.5 million people visit the National Museum of Scotland every year. They come to see some of the 20,000 artefacts that illustrate key moments in our history. From the Pennycook jewels, kept safe by a lowly servant after Queen Mary's execution in 1587, to Bonnie Prince Charlie's picnic set that he brought into combat with the English at the Battle of Culloden. Our first story takes us to Orkney and to one of the northernmost digs in Britain. I've had the privilege of visiting Orkney on numerous occasions, and I've seen some truly astonishing archaeology there. Back in 2010, I saw the Westry Wifey, which is the earliest depiction of a human from the British Neolithic. In 2011, I was lucky enough to see an intact Neolithic tomb being opened. But in recent years, the most astonishing discovery has been at the Ness of Brodgar, which is quickly becoming the most important Neolithic site in Britain. Sitting right in the heart of the Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site is the Ness of Brodgar. Along with nearby Skara Brae and Maes Howe, it now belongs amongst the most famous prehistoric sites in Britain. Our ancestors settled to farm, trade and thrive on this land over 5,000 years ago. And because they built in stone, their traces are still visible all over the island. At Skara Brae, we find elaborate stone houses. And at Maes Howe sits a huge chambered tomb for the dead. But the Ness of Brodgar is becoming another vital piece in this Neolithic puzzle. It's offering unique insights into how our ancestors lived. The team filmed themselves in this, their 8th season, uncovering clues to the world of our ancestors 5,000 years ago. Some of the finds are quite prosaic.
You know, it looked like paving or fallen roof slabs. Bang, 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 bang. And I was able to see a really pretty orange sandstone artifact.
And some artefacts tell of a confident trading people who roamed the nearby seas.
The person who made this, and the people who used it, and the people who saw it at the Ness of Brodgar back in the Neolithic, would have recognised an object which invited parallels with Shetland. In other words, this is an object being made by somebody and used by somebody down here who was aware of traditions of making tools that stretched up through the Northern Isles and up to the Shetland archipelago.
It's clear that the Ness of Brodgar is important to people in Orkney, but exactly how it was used remains a mystery. But some of the artefacts are pointing to something which could be interpreted as ritualistic, something sacred.
What we're dealing with here is a fragment of a very classic later Neolithic artefact called a mace head. Like many mace heads at the Ness, we tend to find them in fragmentary conditions. They're broken.
A mace head is part of a blunt Stone Age weapon or tool. Now, some of these might have broken during use, but archaeologists believe that others could have been ceremonially decommissioned.
We're getting deposits of objects like these at the Ness, which suggests that perhaps sometimes we might be dealing with a more deliberate act, where sometimes an object, because of its biography, because of who it was associated with in life, perhaps when that person died, that object had to be taken out of commission, deliberately broken in the way that people might have, broken swords at the end of a commission or taking weapons out of use.
These broken mace heads are adding to a series of finds curated at the National Museum of Scotland. So what have we got here?
Well, we have a selection of carved stone objects, all from Skara Brae, which is a settlement not too far away from Ness of Brodgar.
Yeah.
And there's been an awful lot of speculation as to what these things were, what they were for. I think people agree that they were certainly symbols of power. They could have been used as weapons, because you could deal somebody a pretty painful blow with one of these, or you could put cord around them and swing them around. And indeed, there's at least one skull that's got a depressed blunt fracture, so they could well have been used. With something like this, you could keep it in your fist and deal somebody a horrible blow with a spiky point.
One of the things I really love about prehistory is finding objects like this, which are so intriguing and so enigmatic, and I don't think we'll ever really know what they were used for, but we can still really appreciate the art and the skill that went into making them.
Oh, exactly. And clearly they would have selected beautiful, aesthetically pleasing stones, probably cobbles from the beach. And they wouldn't have had metal tools, obviously, so they would have used stone tools, sand, water, a lot of elbow grease. And many, many hours of work went into making something like this.
These objects and the smashed pieces of stone maces from the Ness of Brodgar suggest that the Ness may have been a ritual site, and every day the team find more evidence.
Here we've got quite a nice incised stone. You can see there's various lines crisscrossing each other here, forming kind of chevron, zigzags patterns here. And this is a kind of piece of Neolithic artwork that's been built into the main structure of the building. We're finding these sort of decorated stones built into all the walls, internally and externally, across the site.
The archaeologists believe that this prehistoric artwork is further evidence that this was a ritual complex. And now Nick Card and his team believe that they have found the spiritual centre, a Neolithic temple.
Here we're standing next to structure 10, the so-called Neolithic Cathedral. It's over probably 25 metres long, 20 metres wide almost. Everything about it would just scream ritual, religion. You still get a sense of what this building must have been like in its heyday. Truly amazing.
This Neolithic cathedral has been robbed of its stone over thousands of years, making one of this year's discoveries even more remarkable. The entrance to it, marked by the threshold stone.
What we're standing on here is the original entrance. It's about 1.8 metres wide and almost a metre across. We'd always been a bit wary about where the entrance was, and because of the robbing, this was just not clear at all, as we knew that it had to be facing towards Maes Howe.
This connection to the chambered tomb of Maes Howe and the growing acceptance that Orkney's Neolithic monuments could be linked makes the final discovery inside the temple astounding. A standing stone at the centre of this ritual complex. The archaeologists wonder, was this altar of central importance in Neolithic Orkney?
Just half a mile away you have Maes Howe, a few hundred metres away, Stones of Stenness, and behind us on the skyline, the Ring of Brodgar. They all seem to be clustering around the Ness. And I think 5,000 years ago, it maybe wasn't the great stone circles, the Ring of Brodgar and the Stones of Stenness, which today kind of dominate our thinking of this landscape. It really is, it's the Ness of Brodgar 5,000 years ago that maybe held that kind of very central position. And all these other monuments were maybe just peripheral to what was happening here.
This important site really is shaping the archaeological world.
You know, we always are kind of a bit London-centric, southern British-centric, with some of the great monuments like Stonehenge and Wessex area. But this, with the rest of Orkney, is really turning the map on its head. The scale of it, the architecture. It's an archaeologist's dream site.
A 5,000-year-old temple at the heart of a sacred landscape, built out of stone over hundreds of years. And what is most amazing of all is that the digging suggests that this entire complex was abandoned almost overnight. So what happens at the end at the Ness of Brodgar?
Well, certainly it seems as though this huge structure 10 was deliberately decommissioned, and they marked the occasion by having this ginormous feast with hundreds of cattle. And of course, we'll never know for sure, but we can say it probably wasn't climate change. So there wasn't a tsunami, there wasn't a catastrophe. They weren't invaded by other people. I suspect that they had engaged in this sort of spiral of increasing investment of effort, so that by the time you've built Structure 10 and you've built the Ring of Brodgar, you've involved probably most of the population of Orkney. And how then do you top it? So it may well have been a kind of social boom and bust You know, they couldn't trump it, so they realised that, you know, the number was up. But also, it's got a much more complicated story, because it seems as though people were coming from the Stonehenge area almost in a pilgrimage kind of way, because you get houses at Durrington Walls near Stonehenge that look like the houses at Skara Brae.
It does seem like a golden age for Orkney, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
5,000 years ago, our ancestors abandoned a cathedral erected here in stone. And this year's archaeology is also telling another story of the shifting power of the gods along the largest frontier ever built on our shores. One of the most obvious footprints of the Romans in Britain is, of course, Hadrian's Wall. Stretching from coast to coast, this 75-mile-long wall divided the wilds of the north from the Romanised south. And dotted along the wall were military garrisons, where Roman soldiers lived, trained, and worshipped. Now, recent excavations are changing the way we look at religion along the wall. In 2011, I visited the very start of a dig at the Roman site of Binchester in County Durham. The barracks sprung up in the 1st century AD when the Roman army was asserting its power in northeast England. The first trenches yielded just animal bone and other refuse as the team searched for clues into the everyday lives of Roman legionaries. 3 years on, one of the biggest and best preserved Roman barracks in Britain has emerged, offering insights into all aspects of Roman occupation.
I'm standing right in the trench of a Roman communal toilet. Going to a toilet was a social activity in the Roman period. And there would have been a series of perhaps 1, 2, 3, or even 4 toilet seats next to each other. There's a big conduit coming through, and when it rained, which it does a lot up here in County Durham, that water would have flushed everything through and kept our latrine block cleansed, and Roman Binchester, if not sweet smelling, it would have made it a little less unsavoury.
Near the Roman toilets, David and his team dug down 7 feet to reveal another incredible discovery: a Roman bathhouse with plaster still clinging to its walls.
The end of our 5th week on site. Oh, that's right. And in the last week or so, we have finished clearing out the interior of what you can see is an exceptionally well-preserved Roman bathhouse. Behind me here, you can see we have the benches, and this shows this is probably a Roman changing room.
Then David and his team make an important discovery, one that explains the extraordinary preservation of the bathhouse.
This is the middle of our final week, week 7 at Roman Binchester. Beside me is a deep pit. It goes down about 7 or 8 courses, and you've got a foundation at the bottom. That's much, much deeper than we were expecting it to go. We always thought the bathhouse survived really well because it was partly terraced into the hillside, and then it got filled in with lots of Roman rubbish. What's increasingly clear is the building was constructed as a freestanding building, and then the street levels outside rose up around it. And then, with the rubbish rising up on the inside, the entire thing became embedded in Roman archaeology, either side of the walls. The whole structure was filled right up to roof height with massive quantities of Roman rubbish, which basically stopped it falling down.
And buried within this rubbish are precious objects that today hold clues for us about religion and worship on these walls.
This is a silver ring with a tiny gemstone on it, and on that gemstone is a carved early Christian symbol. And this is found in the fort itself, so this came from one of our barracks.
Right, so what have we got on there? It's absolutely tiny.
It's absolutely tiny. You've got an anchor, and suspended from it are a pair of fish. In the 3rd and 4th century, which is when this probably dates from, the cross wasn't yet used as the symbol of Christianity. So instead it was other symbols, such as this one, and that's how we know it belongs to the early Christian faith.
Wow. So what have we got here? What's this?
This is the carved head of probably of a Roman god, which we found mixed up with all the rubbish in the bathhouse.
OK, so how old is that then?
This is probably 2nd or 3rd century AD. And it's beautiful because it's got the nice carved hair, kind of classical style hair, but the eyes are very, very kind of Celtic looking. That almond shape kind of reminds you of the kind of art which the local indigenous Britons were making.
So we've got the early Roman head there and the late Roman rings. So we're spanning, what, 3 or 4 centuries of religion in this site?
Yeah, there's a huge amount. We've also found altars, we've found all sorts of other religious objects, and it would have permeated their day-to-day existence. So the head and the altars, they came from a bathhouse, they don't come from a temple, but everywhere the Romans were, they're expressing their beliefs.
And there's the transition, isn't there, to Christianity? I mean, the head is, can we call it pagan? And then we've got the Christian symbology on the ring.
Absolutely. Christianity becomes a kind of legal religion in the Roman Empire in the 4th century. This ring is probably some of the earliest evidence we have for Christianity. And it's nice. It shows that Binchester had a range of different beliefs and that people were probably worshipping pagan gods. At the same time, others were celebrating their Christian belief.
Almost 100 miles along the wall, a team in Maryport has made another important discovery about shifting religious beliefs on the Romans' great frontier.
So here we are at Maryport on the Cumbrian coast, and we're about to see the unearthing of a monument that was originally carved in the 2nd century when Maryport was part of the coastal defences linked to Hadrian's Wall. And you can see there some of my colleagues in action. That's the excellent Tony Wilmot, the site director, one of Britain's...
That's lovely. What is that? Is that an altar?
That is indeed an altar.
Takes your breath away.
We're going to get this altar out now, see if it's complete. I'm going to first of all get these big stones out, and then John's going to dive in and clean it up. So get cracking.
And how close was this site to the wall itself?
Well, Maryport is actually part of the Cumbrian coastal complex. So Hadrian actually extends the line of turrets and towers along the Cumbrian coast from Hadrian's Wall. So we're quite a way south of the actual wall.
Is it complete?
Yes, it is.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear.
And there you can see the text, IOM at the top.
That's something to do with Jupiter, I know that.
It is indeed. It's Jupiter, the best and the greatest, Jupiter Optimus Maximus. And below that, we can actually see who dedicated it.
Prefect, Commanding Officer, VSLM. Set it up to fulfil a vow.
That tells us the name not only of the unit, but of the man, a guy called Attius Tutor. And we've actually got 3 other dedications by this guy from Maryport.
6, hey!
This is the bit where the guys risk a hernia. It's a big thing.
Now all we've got to do is get it to the car, isn't it?
Oh, you're on your own.
John Lasky, worthy of Mr. Hutton, isn't it?
What can I say? Shattered.
Yes. 25 years ago, when I started digging at Bird Oswald, I said if anyone found an inscription, there was malt whiskey in it.
Right.
John?
Oh, thank you.
That's a fantastic find. And the inscription, it just looks so crisp.
It does look crisp, doesn't it? It does look crisp. And that's Cumbrian red sandstone for you. In fact, when we look at it very closely, you can see it has experienced some weathering.
How many altars did you find there?
We're actually nudging the total of known altar fragments from that site up to about 22, 23 now.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So why are they buried in the ground then?
For a long time, the assumption was that as these altars appeared so crisp, and as there were so many that were obviously dedicated in a very short space of time in the 2nd century, often by the same named individual, well, the assumption was that each time a new altar was put up, the one that had been dedicated the year before was buried on the spot.
So it was almost like they were being ritually buried.
That was the explanation.
Make room for the next one.
To make room for the next one. But in fact, the Romans don't do things like that. We know now they don't do things like that. they were being buried much later, they are dug to support a massive timber structure on the site.
So they were being used as foundations?
They were being used for foundations, yes.
So this is fascinating. These Roman altars then, which obviously had huge ritual significance to the people that made them and set them up, are just being used as foundation stones, as objects of no ritual significance, really.
Not anymore. Jupiter is no longer the best and the greatest. There's a new landscape at Maryport.
From abandoned Roman temples telling the death of an empire, we travel 160 miles south to find ancestors living in Britain just after the end of the Ice Age. One of my favourite prehistoric sites has to be Starcar in East Yorkshire. And we covered this site on a previous series of Digging for Britain, where I talked to Nikki Milner about the astonishing discoveries that she and her team were making. Now, this year, she's been excavating at a nearby site called Flixton Island. And this one goes back even earlier, back beyond 11,000 years ago.
Day 7, and we're really excited because we're right on the edge of what would have been the lake, and we've just started finding some animal bones.
Well, we've come down into the earliest peak. We've come across what looks like to be horse bones. So we've got a horse pelvis, half of the pelvis, and a horse scapula as well, which is really fantastic to see the preservation of it, considering how old it is.
This site dates back almost to the Ice Age. Organic finds from this era are practically unheard of, but Flixton is rewriting the record. 11,000 years ago, this land was an island, used by Stone Age hunter-gatherers. When the water that surrounded the island drained, the lake bed turned to peat, preserving vital clues to this lost world.
It's day 20 at Flixton Island, and I'm sitting in front of something very, very exciting indeed. These are actually hoof prints which have been made in the mud by animals over 11,000 years ago.
The horses were probably walking along the edge of the lake in muddy conditions. Soon afterwards, sand and gravel gently washed over the print, preserving them in time.
These are quite small, but we know that they're horse hoof prints because we've actually found horse hooves in the trench. And this is a half of a horse hoof. And if I just put that in there, you can see that it actually fits beautifully.
And Nikki, here are some of these horse bones from Flixton Island. They're incredibly well preserved, aren't they?
They are.
And we've got a distal phalanx here, the very end of a horse's leg. So that's the bone that sits just underneath the hoof,
yes,
as we saw in the film.
Yes, and that fits nicely into the hoof prints on site.
They're actually quite small horses, aren't they? I mean, I'm looking at these bones and they are from adult horses. The ends of the bones are fused to the shaft, so these aren't juveniles, they're adults, but they're small adults.
They do seem to be very small, and probably more like pony size. We've got this jaw as well. I mean, this is quite small too, and you can see the teeth in the end here. And then we've also got a piece of a pelvis, which we know is pelvis because this is the bit where the leg bone fits in.
Yeah, that's the hip socket. So these are wild horses on Flixton Island?
That's right, yes. And they become extinct quite soon after the end of this site. And what's really incredible is that these are the last wild horses that we think we've got in Britain. After that, they die out. We don't have any Mesolithic sites with horses on them.
And how rare is this site?
It's incredibly rare. We only have about 30 in the whole country, which is a really small number if you compare with other sites of different periods. And most of these sites tend to have lots of flint on them. There's only one other site which actually has any bone on it at all. And so bone from this period is incredibly rare, and it just gives us more of an insight into the environment and what people are doing at this time. In fact, it's really, really unique for the whole of Europe. It's a very, very important site.
As the month-long dig nears its end, clues about human activity also emerge. the team begin to notice that some of the animal skeletons have parts missing.
We've got the middle bit of the spine here, and it curves around to the lower bit. And then this large bit just here is the sacrum, which is at the bottom of the spine, and that's where the hips articulate at. But what's really interesting is that up here, these vertebrae would have the ribs attached to them, but they're not there anymore. And the sacrum would have the pelvis attached, but that's not there either.
The team believes that humans slaughtered this horse 11,000 years ago on Flixton Island.
They must have come over in boats to the island and killed at least 6 or 7 horses. And they seem to have just taken away the really meaty parts. It's likely that they were here for a very, very short period of time, just enough for this to have happened, because there's no other evidence of occupation, there's very little flint or anything like that. What I love about being an archaeologist is that you peel back the layers of soil to reveal a past landscape that hasn't been seen for thousands of years. This is amazing for us because it's a period of time which we know very little about, and it gives us a real snapshot into how people were living just after the end of the last ice age.
So we do have archaeological artefacts as well from the island.
We do. This is a long blade, and we only have a few of these, but this is a typical tool of that period.
And what would it have been used for?
Well, we actually know from microscopic analysis exactly what this particular blade was used for. It was, first of all, this point was used for piercing through the skin and cutting through skin. This side was used for butchery of meat. And then right at this bottom end, there's polish, which shows that perhaps someone was holding the blade using a very soft cloth.
So it's definitely a blade for butchery rather than a projectile point for killing an animal.
Yes, definitely. We have proof it's for butchery.
Now, can you be absolutely sure that the humans are implicated in the death of these horses? Because couldn't these horses have died naturally, and this could have just been an item that was dropped by somebody visiting the island?
Well, it's very rare, but we do have a few pieces of bone which do have butchery evidence on them. They've got cut marks, so we are sure that they were actually killed by humans.
So humans killing these wild horses towards the end of the Ice Age, do you actually think that humans were instrumental in the local extinction of the horses?
Well, there are two possibilities. Certainly, we've got evidence here that people are butchering them and butchering large numbers. But there's also the question of the change in environment. The climate's changing at this time. It goes from, after the end of the Ice Age, a very open, tundra-like landscape, and then it begins to get very wooded very quickly, just within a matter of a couple of 100 years. And the horses tend to prefer the more open environments. So perhaps it was environmental change, perhaps it was humans killing them, perhaps it was a bit of both.
These tiny hoof prints frozen in time give us an amazing snapshot of the world of our hunter-gatherer forebears as the Ice Age ended. But such amazing archaeological discoveries are often under threat from erosion. Hundreds of ancient monuments are lost before they're ever studied or even known about.
But in Scotland, there's a team working to fight the tide and record as much information as they can before it's too late.
The team is the award-winning Scape Trust, and they've made a name for themselves by getting to sites in the nick of time. On Sanday in Orkney sits a precarious Bronze Age site, uncovered by a storm back in 2005. It's now in danger of being swallowed by the sea unless it can be rescued in time. Tom Dawson has a plan to save it.
The site, unfortunately, is going to be lost to the sea at some point. We don't know exactly when, but it could be the next big storm which will take it away. So by moving this site and reconstructing it, we are saving something for people to come and look at, so that they can share in the exciting discoveries made by the Sandy Archaeology Group.
The team embarks on a complete excavation, recording each detail for further research. During this process, one find takes them by complete surprise. A Bronze Age well covered by the bank
And we've just discovered that at the bottom they have actually cut into the bedrock. So the material you can see there is bedrock, and they've made a large hole, built walls up on the sides, but they've just left the back as bedrock and then placed that lintel spanning the two side walls. And there is a gap, which I can put my hand up, between the bedrock and the wall, and presumably what happens is the water would run down the bedrock here and then fill up this chamber.
This structure is an astonishing addition to the already impressive site. But being so close to the sea, it has little chance of survival. So the team carefully dismantles it for the move to the Heritage Centre.
We've had great support from the local community in Sandy, who've come out with their JCBs, their tractors and trailers, and everyone's mucking in and helping us to move the site from here several miles to the other side of the island.
The result is that this 3,000-year-old piece of archaeology has been saved, instead of being lost forever.
It's been an absolutely fantastic effort, and after just a couple of weeks, here you can see the site. We're hoping that people will come here and learn about the site that's been rescued from the sea.
So that's a lot of work to save one archaeological site. How many sites do you have like this across Scotland?
Well, there are hundreds of sites which are at risk, and we're working with communities all over the place. So although the problem is large, by working with these groups, or at least we're making a small difference.
Scape has also been at work in the county of Fife, recording artwork carved into a series of coastal caves during Pictish times.
Well, this is Jonathan's cave over in East Weems, and this is one of 6 caves that survive. These are all very typical Pictish carvings. That was a leaping salmon.
Not a rocket, then?
That's not a rocket, no. And this is a double disc and a trident.
So if you've got Pictish engravings on the wall, when do those date to, do you know?
Well, they're going to be probably somewhere between the 5th and the 8th century AD. And this is actually thought to be a Viking boat, and this might be one of the only representations of a Viking boat in Britain.
So there are a lot of carvings in this cave?
There is the largest collection of carvings anywhere in the United Kingdom, well, in fact, anywhere in the world. And here what we're doing is we're using both laser scanners and photographic techniques to make a 3D recording both of the caves and of the carvings themselves.
Right, so there will be a permanent record of these carvings for all future researchers.
There will be, and this is the most accurate record that's been made to date. This is sub-millimetre accuracy.
That's fantastic. So are these engravings in this cave actually under threat?
They are. They're under threat from a variety of things. There's not only people who go in and occasionally write things on the cave walls. In the past, somebody set fire to a car in the caves, which caused a collapse. But also, we have the instability of the rock and also coastal erosion, of course, which there is the danger the sea will enter the caves at some point.
So it's really important to create this record.
And I think you've been up in the Outer Hebrides as well, haven't you, where the sea really is a problem?
It really is, yes. We've been up in North Uist over in the Outer Hebrides. The site had been reported by local people who've been finding wooden objects, and these have now been dated thanks to the excavation to the Iron Age.
Oh, you're right on the beach here.
One of those little metre-square test pits.
This is an unusual way of digging, but we were trying to stop the sea from taking everything away, so the idea was that we could backfill the test pits. This was a problem. The tide was covering the site twice a day, so we had to work fast.
So you're basically working at low tide, and then you have to just get out at high tide.
Yeah,
and bail out.
We had to bail out. So every day when we came down, the site would look like this, and there would be bailing the site out, and then we could carry on digging. But what was frustrating is the speed with which the tide could come up. So you might be in the middle of doing your drawing, and then you'd have to abandon your trench.
Yeah.
Come back the next day, and it would have filled up with sand again.
And then clean up again.
Clean up again.
Have you finished work there, or are you going back?
We're hoping to go back in the future, but for the moment, we were just trying to work out what might be there.
I have to say, I love the Scape project. You seem to go from strength to strength, and I do follow you year on year. It's wonderful to see archaeologists working so closely with local communities and literally saving archaeology from being washed away. Rescue archaeology like this often turns up astonishing chance discoveries. But sometimes it's sheer persistence by archaeologists that pays off. Researchers in Western Scotland were in their 8th year at Ardnamurchan as they set out to examine what they thought was a pile of stones in a field. They discovered something which had never been found before in mainland Britain, an intact Viking boat burial. And they recorded the moment of excavation. And we're joined by Hannah Cobb, who's one of the directors of the excavation out there on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. Hannah, talk us through your dig.
Initially, we thought it was perhaps a clearance cairn from farming. The moment we took the turf off, it was a boat shape, and we felt nervous. We didn't want to say to ourselves, this is a Viking boat burial, but we excavated it very slowly, carefully. This is the point where we lifted the axe, taking it as carefully and getting it in there as securely as possible. But everyone was crowded round and everyone was quite excited to see, so it was a lovely moment for the team.
Well done, Gary. That's a round of applause.
And at that point, you knew it was a boat burial that you were looking at.
Yeah, and as we got down through the layers, we began to find the artefacts and the fact that it was very clearly a boat shape.
Wonderful, aren't they? Wow. So there's that axe head.
There it is. It's amazing, and it's actually got the some of the wood from the handle that it would have been on still preserved within it.
Just tell us about the sword.
And the sword is fantastic. It's actually broken, but it wasn't broken when it was put into the grave. It's broken subsequently because of sort of all the things that happen to artefacts when they're in the soil. But it's made up of some amazing materials. It's got part of a sheath on it, and then on top of that, it's actually got this textile adhered on the outside of it.
Oh, that's amazing.
It's really amazing. All the way down there, you can see the detail.
Oh my goodness, could that be the clothing of the Viking himself then?
It certainly could, and the way it was laid out within the burial, it was against the side of the Viking, so probably pressed against either his clothes or her clothes or the material that was wrapped around them in death.
It was a proper traditional Viking burial then, inside a boat?
Yes, and unfortunately, in this case, the wood from the boat wasn't particularly preserved, but all of the rivets of the boat, so over 200 rivets from the boat, were all preserved.
So did you have any skeletal remains associated with this?
Unfortunately, the preservation of the artefacts is amazing, and the preservation of the human remains was very poor, so we just had 2 teeth, but we've been able to get lots of information from the teeth because we've been able to do stable isotope analysis of them. Which is
brilliant. So if you've done isotope analysis, do you know where this person grew up?
It was somewhere north, further north than here, potentially Norway.
So potentially an actual Viking?
Yes,
from
indeed.
Scandinavia?
Yes.
Yeah. But what was it about this site that made the Vikings choose to bury their chieftain here? The team have been working on this peninsula for 8 years now and have identified a pattern of burials spanning 5 millennia. First, they excavated a Neolithic chambered cairn. Then they found evidence of a Bronze Age kist. They believe the Vikings chose to be associated with these ancient burial sites. As well as excavating the Viking boat burial, the team are also investigating the cairn and the Bronze Age kist.
It's day 1 on the Ardnamurchan Transition Project, and we're doing an amazing job at deturfing an enormous trench. And who knows what it's going to be? There's bits coming out that might look a bit curby. There's bits coming out that look like cairn material. That's what we're expecting, but when it's from, who knows?
The piled rocks of the Neolithic cairn are familiar to the archaeologists, but the Bronze Age kist contains something very surprising.
Crawling into the excavation tent.
Yeah. What we've got here essentially, we've got a long one coming up there.
Wow.
Long one coming down there. So we think the foot's not really coming up, so it might have just deteriorated. Especially knee up here, we think. And that kind of mushy stuff that's kind of broken off a bit. Probably the pelvis. And the skull fragments are coming up somewhere in here, so it's kind of count.
So fetal almost.
Yeah, crouched, kind of fetal information.
Wow.
Individual crouch burials in stone-lined kists were common in the Bronze Age. But after further examination, the researchers conclude that this kist contains the remains of at least 2 people, and this is very rare. The Viking boat burial, the Bronze Age kist, right next to a Neolithic burial chamber, means people have been bringing their dead to this bay for over 5 millennia. Wow, it's incredible to think of that being a cemetery site for that long.
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously a really special landscape where people were burying their dead for a really long period of time. And I think the fact that the Neolithic tomb was built there and was obviously very visible within the landscape was something that then attracted people to come back again and again to the monument.
And just picking up on that Bronze Age kist, the thing which really intrigued me from the video was that you found 2 burials in that kist. That is unusual, isn't it?
It is. It's a very unusual thing. Traditionally, Bronze Age tombs, Bronze Age kists would have a single individual. And this wasn't just 2 people crouched, as you would also expect in the Bronze Age, but it was sort of disarticulated human remains, so bits of bodies mixed up. Potentially, people were recalling the practices that had occurred at this Neolithic tomb. Potentially, this was just the way that they venerated their dead here.
Digs like Ardnamurchan tell us of long spans of ancient time with changing burial rituals. But sometimes archaeology and British history collide to paint a vivid snapshot of a single event. In the 15th century, the aristocracy, people like Richard III and his noblemen, threw lavish feasts and banquets complete with grand entertainment, music, games, and lots of drinking. A dig in North Yorkshire has uncovered a feasting hall from this period with evidence of revelry on an epic scale. But they've also discovered how one night the feasting and laughter came to a very abrupt end. For the last 5 years, a team of volunteers has been digging on the former estate of Sir John Conyers, a 15th century nobleman. Every day, the diggers find new treasures amongst the rubble. The site has kept the team busy, logging artefacts pulled from the ruins of this aristocratic banqueting hall.
You found it. Well done. It's part of a latch, either from a door or from a big piece of furniture like a chest.
This medieval hall was massive. It could hold upwards of 1,000 people. And in this hall, the powerful and influential met, the movers and shakers of the day. It was here that Conyers rubbed shoulders with King Edward IV and Richard III.
This is a site where the important decisions on political power in England in the mid-15th century, the 1460s, the 1470s are made.
The hall reflected Conyers' high social standing. And as the team dig further, they find artefacts left over from the lavish banquets that were thrown here.
There you go, thank you. It appears to be part of a serving dish, either a meat panchion or what's known as a dripping pan, which was used to serve sizzling meat dishes at the table. So we've got a bit of food bone. By the size of it, it's a hunted species. We found a lot of evidence of people eating venison and boar, but sometimes other exotic species.
Being able to afford to eat exotic foods, such as crane, peacock or beaver, was certainly a sign of high status. But it wasn't just the food that was posh.
This is the handle of a 1-gallon wine jug. These would have been on the table to serve a half-pint drinking jug, usually of red wine, probably originating in the Bordeaux region of southern France.
These feasts were integral to maintaining power and influence. But for the Conyers, their influence would not last. In 1485, Henry Tudor defeated Richard III
seizing the crown. So John Conyers went from being an ally of the king to being a real threat.
Eric, what on earth happened to this feasting hall?
It was attacked. A force, we believe acting on the orders of the Tudor government, was sat to the northwest of the building, and they attacked it with cannon. This is a piece of a cannonball.
So this is a cannonball, you can be sure of that?
Oh, we certainly can. You have a series of striations along the leading edge of it caused by it being fired and going through the barrel of the gun.
So is that shattered on impact?
It did. It was fired into the building and it shattered, bits flying everywhere. There are probably other bits lying in there that we've not been able to identify. Probably started the fire that destroyed the building and the collapse event which succeeded the fire, causing the vast area of rubble that we found.
So what exactly had Conyers done to annoy the Tudors?
He was intimately associated with the previous regime. He carried the sceptre at Richard III's coronation. He was made a Knight of the Garter by King Richard III. He is alleged in 1487 to have been conspiring with King James III of Scotland to place the Earl of Warwick, who was in prison in the Tower of London, on the throne in place of Henry Tudor.
So essentially he was on the wrong side?
He was most definitely on the wrong side.
And what about this pottery then? Is this high-status pottery?
It is very high-status pottery. It was imported from Flanders, from Belgium, and would have been displayed prominently at the high table and on the buffet that would have adjoined it.
So this little piece of pot, I mean, what would that have been part of?
It's a half-pint wine jug. You can imagine the consequences of drinking half pints of red wine on a regular basis. We found evidence in the form of dislodged healthy human front teeth. Another stranger things like severed digits from statues. We have three severed fingers from statues, clearly.
So these feasts could be quite rowdy affairs,
yes. Oh, yes, indeed, yes.
Beautiful pottery, though.
It is. It's a type of pottery called lusterware that was very popular in the mid to late 15th century.
And it's still lustrous as well.
It is
I like
indeed,
that.
yes.
So we've got this this family led by Conyers himself, who were very influential, very wealthy, and we're seeing a snapshot really of them, presumably at the height of that wealth
Indeed,
and influence.
Yes.
What happens after this?
The family's influence and power declines. After 1513, it just disappears. By 1580, they've declined into obscurity.
Conyers' downfall is documented by history and the destruction of his hall by archaeology. From Tudor banqueting halls to hoof prints leading us to Ice Age butchers to temples and Roman gods fallen from grace.
Well, it has been a fantastic year, so good luck to all our archaeologists in the north as they continue digging for Britain. It's good night from him.
And it's good night from her.